Good afternoon, and welcome to our third panel for this Berea Book Fest on ideas and inspiration. After this, we're going to have a presentation by another author, Silas House, who will be talking about sense of place. So after this presentation, if you have nowhere to go, stick around. We'll have one more. And as of right now, we've been kind of doing introductions, so we're going to continue doing that, if that's okay. So if we could just go down and kind of, who are you, and what have you done, and maybe something about yourself in terms of literature and writing.
Okay. I'm Dr. Marshall Myers. I am a rhetorician. Do you all know what that is? Not many people do. But at any rate, I approach writing from not only the standpoint of the practical, that is writing short stories or poems or articles or whatever, and I also approach it from the point of view of the theoretical. And rhetoric, which is one of the oldest of the arts, and it is one of the 7 arts, grew out of ancient Greece and Rome. And I'm retired from Eastern, where I taught courses in linguistics and rhetoric, obviously, composition. And I live now in Richmond, and I write more or less full-time, I guess, half-time, whatever you want to call it. So, at any rate, that's sort of my resume in a brief form, I think. I write everything from academic articles to creative writing sorts of things. Thank you.
I'm Tasha Cotter. I work at the University of Kentucky, staff member in landscape architecture, also teach at UK. Primarily I write poetry, so I'm a 2010 graduate of the EKU Low Res program, the Bluegrass Writer Studio. I'm also the president of the Kentucky State Poetry Society. So my third book of poetry, Astonishments, is coming out in the spring of 2020 with Future Cycle Press. More lately, I've been getting into fiction writing.
Oh, speaking of. I'm Ardeen Johnson, but everyone calls me Bob, so do. And I direct the creative writing program at Eastern Kentucky University, Bluegrass Writer Studio. Tasha was one of our first graduates. And when I was interviewing at EKU, Marshall was on the committee, so it's his fault. And I write fiction and creative nonfiction. I have a novel called Californium, a collection of stories called Delicate Man, and I just finished a collection of essays that I'm shopping now, and my fingers are crossed, and it doesn't matter how many publications you have. When you have something new, you're just like everybody else. You got your fingers crossed, and you tap dance for them, and hope somebody wants to buy your work.
There's kind of a stereotype when it comes to getting inspiration and ideas. Oftentimes it's the person in the shower who all of a sudden has like the brilliant idea for a story or a time machine or whatever. And I was wondering, where have you found your best ideas and inspiration?
I found it in a lot of different places. Mm-hmm. It's true that you write about yourself in what you write. But it's also true that while you're writing, you can discover things that you'd like to write about. Now, particularly, I was writing a short story about a hanging in my home county of a slave who had killed her master. And while I was writing that particular short story, I suddenly saw the need for someone else to talk to her, in particular an Irishman who was the jailer. Now that's an idea that came not as a result of what I had thought, or what I experienced, or what I had read, but also because of things that were part of the writing act itself. As I said, I'm academically trained to look at the writing act. I do read things that I want to write about, and I look for things that have unusual things happening in them. And I do write some poetry now and then when I feel inspired to do such. But I have not written much of anything creative for years, although I just recently finished a couple of essays on an encounter with a rooster and 5 drunk geese. And those were based on experiences that I had as a child.
Well, I think travel and exploration are huge drivers of my creative process. I've always been a bit of an adventurer. I once took one of those personality tests and it told me that I was #1 and open to new experiences. And so I think that also plays a role in the novel I have coming out this summer, Us in Pieces. It doesn't take place in 1 city or 2 or 3, it takes places in about 8 cities. So it's this kind of big sprawling love story. One experience that stands out to me in thinking about travel and what you see when you go places is seeing the Angel Oak on Johns Island in South Carolina. So my husband and I, we vacation to South Carolina quite a lot. I'd always wanted to see the Angel Oak. I'd heard a lot of things about it. And so we go there and I see it and I'm mesmerized. It's just haunting to be in its presence. It's this enormous oak tree. And so I'm taking pictures and just trying to take it all in so I never forget it. Now, it's not that I was writing that day, but months later, that feeling of being in its presence and the moodiness of that whole landscape, that deep south landscape, it wouldn't let me go. And so I slowly started writing a poem about that and sort of weaving in mythologies that I invented. And I usually teach in the summer with Berea Festival of Learn shops, and we talk about where do poems come from. They come from around the world. They come from all around us, really. And so the great thing about writing and creative writing is you get to invent the story, the narrative. You get to invent the folklore. You can invent the mythology, whatever it takes to make that world on the page come to life. And so a poem ended up coming out of that experience of traveling to the Angel Oak and seeing it. And so I really think it's just being awake and thoughtful and mindful when you travel to these new experiences. Because for me, they're huge drivers for me in what I create, poetry or fiction.
I agree with all that. And I would add, I definitely, for inspiration, people, I observe and listen. I'll hit snippets of conversation and dialogue. And I like to, a game my wife and I like to play is to create the story behind the dialogue that we're hearing at the table. And sometimes it turns into a story later. So I'll steal dialogue and turn it into a life and just chase character. Curiosity, and when you're curious about something, I think whatever you're interested in is worthy. And I wrote a story one time because I wondered what it would be like to be a writer for Hallmark and just have to write greeting cards, write those cheesy cards. And I thought, wouldn't it be neat if that guy was in a bad relationship? And so I just chased that story, and I didn't know what the story was going to be about it. I went publishing it, but again, it was just curiosity. It was just fun, and so a lot of times with my fiction, I'm just chasing character or chasing a funny situation that seems interesting to me. With my nonfiction, my wife tells me what to write. And I'm serious because we'll just be casually speaking about something, and I'll be, one time this happened. She's like, why don't you make that an essay? I'm like, oh, that would be a good essay. Okay, so much of my nonfiction is what Julie has told me to write. So I don't have a good answer for that one.
One of the things that we have to consider in inspiration is the influence of the postmodern group upon the whole subject of inspiration. So, for example, first part of John Fowles' Second Lieutenant's Woman, it seems to be a straight narrative, and then all of a sudden you realize that this is a movie that's being transmitted to you through this particular fiction. And Angela Carter's Knights of the Circus has a woman who is 7 or 8 foot tall, and she has wings. She stands outside a house of prostitution. Now, ideas for that kind of fantastic kind of writing come from different places, I think, than what she described as moments of tranquility, what Coleridge was saying. And we have to understand that just because we're dealing with a different approach to the writing of fiction or the writing of poetry or whatever it happens to be, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to follow a particular route or way of doing things.
I was having a conversation yesterday at our reception with one of the authors, and we were discussing different ways of writing ideas down or recording them. And I was wondering, what do you use to record your ideas and inspiration down? And do you have a preferred method?
Well, Hemingway supposedly had a fishbowl, and he would write down something, put it in the fishbowl, and when it came time for him to write something, then he would draw out of the fishbowl until he found something that he wanted to write about. But I will write things on napkins and that sort of thing. There's a Jerry Seinfeld episode where Jerry wakes up in the middle of the night and has this really good joke, and he writes it down. He can't read it the next day. Well, that happens quite literally, quite to some of us. But I think that if you study people's faces, you see a lot of things that you would not see if you didn't study them carefully. So you can look at a person's face, and you can oftentimes tell that there's a story behind that particular face. There's a reason for that person to look the way that he or she does.
For me, it's a notebook that I carry with me. Usually I have 2 or 3 notebooks. I'm staff at UK, so I've got a notebook for things related to my students in the class I'm teaching, but I also have more of a creative notebook that goes everywhere with me that I write things out longhand. And so right now I'm working more on it like a young adult novel. And so what works for me is just writing a page in the evening. So usually 8:30 is my wind down time, 8:30 to 9:30. I just tell myself a page, just write a page. And that's a small achievable goal that works for me. So it never becomes an overwhelming thing. And because my attention is really fractured during the day with students and teaching, I'll usually have some time to type what I wrote the night before into the computer to sort of keep adding on to the manuscript. So I think every book is different. Poetry is certainly very different from longer form writings. But for me right now, this is the process that I have, is that quiet time in the evening to just write a page, to continue the narrative forward, to just slowly keep making forward progress, because at the end of the year, sooner than that, you'll have the book written, right? So that's what I'm working on right now.
I really think that there's a danger if you have an idea to think, okay, I don't have time to write it, and so I'm going to just hold on to it until later, because it may not be there. That's happened to me. Or the flip has also been, you think, well, maybe if I write it now, I'm going to ruin it because I don't have time to give it the time that it needs. But just get the idea down. It'll still be there in some time later. And so yeah, anything you can get, I think works. I would use my phone. I'll just make notes on my phone. I'd like to email myself, because then it's out there in the cloud, and so I don't lose. In case I lose, I can lose ATM receipts, but the cloud is helpful. So I think that's anything electronic is always a good idea for jotting notes down. And I think even whatever you're working on, to make notes in that for ideas, even if you're like, well, that's a scene, that's going to be a later scene. Well, make the note now, because if you don't, it's either going to stay in your head, you're going to struggle with what you're working on, or it's going to go away, and you're going to lose it. So make the note, if you have to do it on another document or at the bottom of the document you're on, and then you can get back to what you're actually working on. But I think it's always make the note when it comes to you. Don't wait on it.
But you never want to think of writing as something that you always do under the spell of inspiration.
Yeah.
The magic synthesis, for example. Writing, you have to face it, is hard work. And a lot of the stuff that you produce is what Hemingway called, you can fill that one in. And so that requires that you practice your particular art no matter what happens to get in the way, or no matter where you are or whatever. If it's time to write, it's time to write. And sometimes writing is difficult because the first 2 or 3 sentences don't seem to have any meaning at all. But after a time, you begin to see that writing is something that you have to do the same way that you have to breathe. That doesn't mean that it's some magical synthesis that all of us have to have in our experience. It just merely means that you have to write. Just simply that.
Kind of a little bit off of what Bob was saying. Something that I know many of us encounter is that brilliant idea that becomes ephemeral, it disappears. Have you ever had a brilliant idea and lost it?
Of course.
How did you overcome it?
Well, of course I have lots of ideas, and lots of them go out the window. It's often been said that a writer can actually say that he is thinking when he's looking out the window. But you just have to remember that I'd say I would think your ideas are going to come to you at a different time too, the same ideas. And sometimes you can write them down, sometimes you can't. It's just a matter of learning to use writing as a way of getting at writing. Writers write, writers read, and as a consequence, they have to read in order to learn to write.
And I think the process that I have now for collecting my ideas the way I do, and what Bob was saying, comes out of losing a lot of ideas. So I've learned that if I don't write something down, even if I'm about to go to sleep, I keep paper beside where I sleep. If I don't write it down, I'm going to lose it. I don't want to take the chance on losing it. So I know that if I don't write it down, I'm never going to have it again. So I've learned the hard way that I've got to have the notebooks, I've got to have the notepads, the sticky notes, because otherwise I lose what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I'm gonna run with that a little bit too, because I've had ideas that I didn't write down fast enough and lost them. But I think this maybe just as frustrating as you have a good idea and you try to write it and it doesn't happen like you thought it was going to. And for that one, for me at least, I have to have more than one project going on at the same time. Because if I keep chasing that project and keep getting frustrated, I'm going to be a really angry, frustrated writer. And I'm not a rich, angry, frustrated writer, so that's even worse. And I've got kids, and I can't be angry with them, so I need another project to jump over to. So I can because either it's gonna stew a little bit. I'm going to come back to it, and it's going to work, or I can just let it go eventually. And it's easier to let go of it if I've got something else that I'm working on. So I always have something else in my pocket to work on.
But you always must remember that your wealth of information and insights are in there. It's just a matter of getting them out.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you may lose an idea, but you may have a better idea later on. So writing is not simply just feeling the moment of inspiration. Writing is something that comes as a result of you're seeing the synthesization of different kinds of experiences. I once saw I guess it was a dog, killed a rabbit, and the dog put his teeth right on the rabbit's jugular vein. And I'd never seen that before, and I thought about that, and that inspired all sorts of ways to look at the act itself. But I wrote it, and I finally figured out that the dog was being quite merciful to the rabbit, to kill it that way. And that didn't come as a result of some flash moment of inspiration. That came as a result of reflection.
This will be my last question, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Sherwood Anderson, in his work Winesburg, Ohio, talks about the grotesque, about the idea, about the kind of the imaginary, like your goal, and then every time you try to manifest it, it comes out imperfect, it comes out flawed. And so how do you translate your ideas and inspiration to the page? Have you had any difficulty?
Sometimes I just dismiss them. I just say, this isn't going to work. I can come up with something better.
So last year, so at UK, I teach the work of Wendell Berry. And so I had been toying with the idea of kind of write a collection of essays about the environment, about where I grew up in Smiths Grove, Kentucky. And, it really felt like a struggle getting that out on paper, and I just wasn't really connecting with the idea of the project. And what ended up coming out of that was more of a sci-fi type novella that came out of that. And I think all that kind of was wrapped up with all the politics that was happening at the time. And so that project came much easier to me. And so I just had to sort of realize that, I'm not that kind of writer. Like, I can't do those kind of essays because it's just, it's not me. And so I kind of had to just move with the creative process, the direction it was taking me. And so I kind of found myself writing more of a sci-fi type story. So the creative process, it's a mysterious thing.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Being willing to take those detours is smart. And I think, and the point Marshall made early on, and I know Tasha, this is Tasha's work rate, it's work, and you have to go at it every day. And so with that in mind, if it's not coming out right the first time, that's okay, because it's a process and it's going to change and grow. And so I've kind of embraced the idea that the first, well, this is Hemingway too, the
Yeah.
first draft of anything is shite. And so it's okay if it didn't come out that great, because it wasn't going to anyway. And some of the advice I got early on as a writer was that you have to live the world of your story. And when you do that, well, you can't know that world on the first draft, and maybe not even the second or third draft. So the more you work with a piece, the more you start to understand what it wants to be about, what it's allowing you to let it be, and you're there to bring it onto the page. But it takes on a life of its own at some point, and I think that's a good thing every time.
As Hemingway said, the first draft is always, and that's probably true. The real job of writing comes in, quote, polishing it to the point of utterance. Nothing you write's going to be good on the first draft, probably. Nothing's going to be good after the third or fourth draft, probably. So it takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of concentration to do the sorts of things. And I'm fortunate that I have somebody who writes, reads what I write and says, this is good or this isn't. And you have to be able to respond to someone like that with the, oh, well, thanks for the help, thanks for the help, thanks for the help. Rather than, oh, you just don't understand. You don't understand the moment that I was in when I wrote that. I don't understand the moment either.
And then questions, I think. Did you have a question?
I have a question.
Yeah, that's okay.
This is something I've always wondered about people who write many stories, not just the one about them, but other stories. And that is, how do you know when your story is done? When does it end? Not just for you as a writer, but how you project your reader is reading that story, and he gets to the end, the last sentence, and says, okay, that was a good story. I don't really want to read anymore. You know, this is the story, it's over.
And it's open, it doesn't have to be in any order.
Yeah, because you all write, so.
Yeah. One of my professors, we would talk about endings in class, and some writers struggle with endings. Their endings are tough. And he said you need to think that you don't write the ending, you find the ending based on what you've done earlier in the story. That the details of your story are juggling balls. You got to throw them up in the air. You're going to catch some of them early in the story, midway through the story, and when you've caught that last juggling ball, that's when the story is over. And so, of course, it doesn't work out perfectly with every story, but a lot of times for me, there's a sense of completion when a detail has come, finally come home to end the story. And it doesn't necessarily, I wrap the story up in a nice, tidy bow. In fact, I don't want to write a story that ends in a nice, tidy bow, but it has a feeling of completion to it. But it's still, every story is going to be different. Some you're going to struggle with. Sometimes you know it's done because you took a chance and sent it, and an editor liked it and published it. My novel, the very last sentence of the novel, I couldn't get it quite right, and my editor said, "Let's just get rid of that last sentence," which freaked me out. And I sent that to my agent, and she's like, "I think he's right." And so then, of course, I ran down the hall to my wife, because she knows better than anybody. And she's like, "They're right." I'm like, "Oh my God." So yeah, the last line of my novel is still on my computer, but it's not in the novel because everybody thought I'd overdone that last line. So sometimes you need good advice from friends, from beta readers.
I think learning to close something is part of the craft. You learn what you need to do at the end in order for the reader to be satisfied. Sometimes satisfaction comes rather quickly to a reader, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the ending has to be spelled out in great detail, and sometimes it has to refer to the ideas that the story began with. But learning to write and learning to end a story are, I think, ends of the same craft more than anything else.
I think more of my experience was with poetry, and I know from my experience with books of poems, I will continually go through and tinker to try to make things a little stronger and always give myself a lot of space between my edits of that manuscript. So a manuscript might take years to place with a publisher. But generally, once it's accepted, then I know that I've really got something and I should start kind of easing back. That it must be close to done if it's been accepted for publication.
I would just add too, you get a sense of the kind of writer you are. I'm an overwriter, and so my assumption is my endings are always going to be overdone, and I'm going to have to pull back. And some people are, they're minimalist, and they might need somebody to say, "We need a little bit more here. It's a little too spacey." So, in some ways, I think it's your own aesthetic, what you want from a story, speaking in fiction at least, and then the kind of fiction writer that you are, and knowing what I struggle with imagery. I know that. Hopefully, the reader doesn't know that, but those are the parts that I know I'm going to have to really work hard on revising. And so, you know yourself to some degree.
So whenever you all are in your writing process and you're coming to the completion, the end of your story, and do you, and I don't know that if any of you have ever written series of stories that play on each other or not, but do you go into the writing process saying, okay, this is a 3-book series? Or do you go into it saying, this is a story that I want to get it on paper, and then at the end of it, you're like, no, actually, you know what, this is going to be more. There's the planning. I feel like the planning must not stop when the writing starts, but is there a point in the writing process where you say, okay, I need to confine where this story is going and not let it grow anymore?
Yeah, sometimes the story can write you rather than you write it. And sometimes you have to be able to deal with that particular ultimatum that the story is giving you. Sometimes, of course, you don't, but there are times when you are writing something when the story will say, it's got to end, it's got to end. And that's difficult sometimes because you're second-guessing yourself in many respects.
I think with the sci-fi novella series that I was talking about earlier, I didn't realize that I could have a series until I was about a quarter of the way through the first book, and I thought I could see how this world would open up into something else. And so ideas occur to you, and the future occurs to you as you're in the process of writing it. Hopefully you get to a point where the end of a book 1 makes sense, and it feels like the right place to sort of open a second book, if that makes sense.
My sister-in-law is a New York Times best-selling romance author, and she thinks in 3 books, so it's from the get-go. And she will admit, not to an audience, but to me, that the second book is always crap. And she's trying to connect the first book to the third book. She hates writing the second book every time. I try to write literary fiction, and so I'm chasing characters, so I don't know where it's supposed to go. But I don't think I think in terms of series, but I do worry about writing too much, and because I want to know my character's backstory, I want to know their through story, and I know I have to cut it off on both ends. And so in terms of just one book or even one story, I do struggle with, okay, how much does my reader really need to know? And I want to make sure I don't overdo it with my reader. I'd rather leave my reader wondering a little bit and trying to connect the dots herself than overdoing it for the reader.
My question kind of piggybacks on that, on how do you discipline yourself to stick to maybe the original story that you had wanted to tell without going into over character development of secondary characters, because you get into the thinking process and then you come up with a character and go, well, how do I not describe him enough, or describe him enough so that my reader is interested and gets a feel for the character, but not so much that he actually turns into the story when this is the story I wanted to write. When I love this character, but maybe that is for another book. Does it make sense to develop your characters?
And he has a book called Rhetoric, by the way. And he said you write for people, you write for an audience, you don't write for yourself. Now some writers will say, I wrote this for myself, and I'm the person who makes the decision about whether it's good or not. But most of the time, 99.9% of the time, except in diaries, you're writing for somebody else. so that that person can understand what you're saying, or feel what you're feeling, or see what you are seeing. And you have to acquire a kind of technique for figuring out just exactly how much do I need to go in order to make this point clear. That's something you have to learn. I was a terrible writer when it began. I mean, for a whole year I got nothing but rejections. I once sent a manuscript out on Wednesday and he came back on Friday. So, I'm immune to what write. Some magazines will say really rather nasty things, and I did resist for the most part saying nasty things back. But basically, you have to learn the craft. Just as if you are a painter, you have to learn the craft. If you are a dancer, you have to learn the craft. If you're whatever you happen to other the arts, you have to learn the craft. And learning the craft means that you have to figure out how to end it, how to begin it, how to name it, how to not deal with the character that you won't want to deal with, whatever. But it is a craft. It is something that you have to learn to do by doing.
Yes.
I have a question for the panel from their perspective as readers. When you are reading a book, do you ever want to rewrite parts of it?
You mean a book that they've written themselves
No.
or any other? Okay.
No, a book that they're reading by someone else. Or do you see flaws in it?
Oh, certainly.
When I'm reading,
Not typos, but
No.
you know, there's just something not right.
when I'm reading aloud to my children, anything that J.K. Rowling has written, I take out all the adverbs. There's not as much striding going on. And I want to edit those books so bad because I think they're so good. Their characters are great. The plots are so much fun. I think they're really smart books. So it's not to say she's not a great writer. She is a great writer. But at the sentence level, I think that at some point somebody said, well, you're J.K. Rowling. We don't have to edit you anymore, or you're not going to listen to them.
Book four.
Yep, thank you. So yes, there's not a lot of authors that do that too, just the famous ones because they can take it.
Well, if you read nothing but Harlequin romances, the chances are pretty great you're not going to write anything but Harlequin romances. So you have to read good people, good stylists. I love the style of Steinbeck. I love the style of Willa Cather. I love the style of other people, Marianne Lynn Robinson, for example. But I don't look at something to see what the errors are. I learn to learn something from that particular writer, what that writer has done well that I have noticed. This is really a good sentence, I might say to myself. And that comes only as a result of experience too. And reading good stuff. If you read trash, you're going to write trash. There's just no way around it.
Oh, but gosh, when I read The Orchid Thief by Susan Orlean, oh my gosh. Susan Orlean, she wrote The Orchid Thief. She missed the boat. I mean, there's so much subtext that she's not touching. She's afraid of that subtext of her own book. Steve Almond does the same thing in Rock and Roll Will Save Your Life, both nonfiction books. Like, don't be afraid of your subtext. But neither, and they're both best-selling books. You know, they're great, but they are seriously flawed books by really good authors. I admire both those authors, and I would not tell them to their face. Steve Almond might punch me. But in my classroom, I'm going to be like, this book fails. And it's okay to say it that it fails, because there's so much that does right and so much that it misses the boat on. You know, she's not the kind of writer. She's a journalist first, and she was just not going to go to subtext. So
We're dealing with a generation of readers. I used to think English majors came to university having read Scarlet Letter, Huckleberry Finn, and so forth. They don't. Their idea of a good writer is Stephen King. And so I think that has something to do with their ability to express themselves. Now, I have read enough of Stephen King to know that I don't want to write like he writes, but I understand how he might be alluring to them. But he is not, quote, in my mind, a good writer.
He never said he was.
No.
Many great books are greatly flawed. If we think about Moby Dick, you know, the first 2 or 3 chapters, the most brilliant things ever, and then it becomes National Geographic. I believe the flaws are part of the greatness of the books in some way.
There's no doubt that great books have great flaws.
Yeah, I agree. Great Gatsby's my favorite book, and it's got a stupid plot.
We were just talking about reading it earlier today.
Yeah, really stupid plot. Great book, stupid plot.
You have a question?
Yeah, seeing as how you all have written fiction, maybe for people that are not, or have not, that may be frightened away from the term literary. So when you say you write literary fiction, what is the dividing line? And people that want to submit online and people that want to submit to publishers, and they'll say, we want fiction written in a literary style. And a lot of people go, what? What? That they may be put off by that term. And maybe you could expound a little bit on the difference between literary and, I don't know, regular fiction, sane fiction, I'm not quite sure.
For
what
me,
the opposite-
literary, it's tackling more complex, complicated ideas than the typical genre-based writing.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm in my intro to creative writing class, I'll say that no one form of fiction is better than the other inherently. They're all, I mean, I couldn't write a romance novel, so I admire someone who can write a New York Times bestselling romance novel. It's its own animal, and it's a talent. So it's not to disparage any kind of writing. But genre writing tends to be plot-based, and literary fiction tends to be character-based, which is why you get a book like Gatsby with a terrible plot and great characters and great sentence-level writing, and you'll get some of the J.K. Rowling's books, which they actually, I think the way they rise above the rest of the genre is the characters are so good. They're so much better. They're not flat. And so for me, that's the main difference. And certainly if you're querying an agent, and they're looking, or you're querying a publisher and they want something literary, you can just call yours literary accessible, and that means mine's literary, but people will actually enjoy it.
Well, I think one of the things that you alluded to was you read good writers. And some of those writers will teach you lots about writing that you never thought you could learn about it. Such as what's the value of the first sentence? What's the value of the last sentence? What's the value of the character? How are the characters defined? Studying writing is the way most writers learn to write. Not, I'm sorry, creative writing programs are not from universities and any place else. Most really good writers learn to write by reading good writers.
You had a question back there, sorry.
Yes. Excuse me. So before you all became professional writers, did you feel discouraged about being interested or going into an industry that had like millions of competitors? And if so, how did you overcome that discouragement to, be where you are now?
I worked in advertising, and I didn't love going to work every day. And I would find myself going home and writing stories, and I didn't know why I was doing that to myself. And then when I left for grad school, I was like, well, I'll apply to grad school, and if I get in, that's probably a sign. And damn it, I got in. And so I had to give up a salary and become a grad student, and my freshman year, my first year of grad school, I lived in the dorms because I went to Kansas State, and I thought they would put me in a graduate dorm, and they put me in a dorm with a freshman.
Oh, God.
I was 27. I could buy him beer. It was a great experience. I was the best man at his wedding. So, but I love you. Just embrace it. One of my best friends is an accountant, but he's not an accountant for the money. He loves it. Like when he's bored, he just checks the stock market because it's so much fun to look at numbers. So I think if it's something that you really want to do, then you should do it. And who cares? Just because writers aren't esteemed the way they were 100 years ago, oh well, I wish they were. They're not. It's okay. We move on.
You're a character straight off of Mad Men. There's a
Don't make me Don Draper.
No, there's a character. He's an ad guy, and he writes novels at night.
Oh yeah, I can't think of his name. I think you're talking about. It's the Patch of his Eye.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anything else? Yeah.
I like him.
A good, healthy lack of self-confidence is a good background for a writer. So that you have to prove to yourself that you can do something that's worthy. But if you are overconfident, it doesn't take long after you start sending things out to learn that you're not the writer you thought you were. And I think one of the things that I identify myself with is writing something that I think I can do better than most people. Not everybody, because I think that many writers are, for all intents and purposes, very bad people. But it is a kind of self-affirming thing that happens when you write something that it turns out that other people think is worthy of reading.
I was always an English lit major in school, so I was in poetry workshops from the get-go, having people read and critique my work around round tables since I was 18 years old. And so you sort of develop a thick skin. Like, I've always liked writing. I always knew that's what I wanted to do. Never really thought much about a career. So when I graduated UK, I got a job in higher ed right out of the gate. And fortunately, I like what I do, especially each job gets a little better. I'm working with students and helping them make their dreams happen, basically, which as a writer, you learn all kinds of things about people, all kinds of things about their own stories. And so it is hard. It's hard to write a poem. It's incredibly hard to get published. Getting a book out into the world takes years and years and years. That's why you have to love it, right? Because it's really easy to just get feeling beat down with all that. But you have to love reading, you have to love writing, you have to love that act of creating something on the page that other people are going to read and respond to. You have to love it to keep at it, I think.
Well, thank you very much. We actually have about 17 minutes till our speaker comes and we have to set the floor. I invite you all to continue the conversation and the questions in the room next door and to check out the writings and the ideas put on pages that they have created. And thank you for being on this panel. Thank you.